Alright, hi everyone, how's it going? And welcome to another video. Now I want to do another video today on someone who recently passed away, and that would be Bruno Sammartino. Now, for those who don't know who Bruno Sammartino is, and surprisingly enough, I've run into quite a few people who don't know who he is. I've mentioned that he died, and they're like, Bruno who? Who is that? And I'm surprised that, they don't know, but, Bruno was not a household name. I think he should have been. And that's kind of why I want to do this video, and I'm going to want to do like a tribute video to him, because, a lot of kids today are probably unaware of the fact that in the 1960s and in the 1970s, there was really, for the bulk of those decades, there was one champion, and that champion of the WWE, or at that time was known as WWF, was Bruno Sammartino. He was the professional wrestling champion. He was champion for 11 years, 10 months. Now, that is unheard of today. No one is champion for that long. I think CM Punk had been champion for maybe about a year and a half. But yeah, Bruno Sammartino was champion for a long time. 11 years, 10 months, almost 12 years. You just don't hear of that happening now, because that was just another era of pro wrestling. It was quite different at that time. Just a little bit of background info on Bruno Sammartino. Bruno Sammartino was born in Italy in 1935. And when he was young, Italy had become war-torn because of World War II. His village was up in the mountains. It was hard to get food to his village. He had become malnourished, and then he got very sick. And so much so that by the time he came to the United States, he only weighed 86 pounds. He came to the United States. His dad had gotten a job at one of the steel mills in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. In those days, Pittsburgh still had steel mills. Now I think only Bethlehem Steel is left, but in those days there were more steel mills. And his dad got, a pretty decent job. You could get a decent job at the steel mills in those days and make pretty decent money. And the work may have been hard, but yeah, the money was pretty good from what I understand. But Bruno then went to school. He was picked on in school. A friend of his got him a membership at a Jewish version of the YMCA, although anyone could join. And Bruno joined that, and he started lifting weights, and he just fell in love with the weight room. He got addicted to working out. He just did it all the time. And you hear of pro wrestlers talking about that moment quite often. They discovered weights, they got a weight set, or they got a gym membership, and then they started working out all the time. And that's common among a lot of pro wrestlers, I believe. But that was definitely the case with Bruno Sammartino. Very quickly, Bruno got pretty strong. When he started high school, he was only 86 pounds. When he graduated from high school, he was 220 pounds. And he began doing a lot of powerlifting. In 1959, Bruno Sammartino had set the bench press record at 565 pounds. And Bruno only weighed 265. So that was quite an impressive feat. And these powerlifting competitions that he would win brought him to the attention of Vince McMahon Sr., who ran what was then known as the WWF, which is now WWE. It was a Northwest professional wrestling territory. And he got Bruno Sammartino to become a pro wrestler. And Bruno talks about this. He talks about one of the wrestlers, because wrestlers want you to, respect the business. So one of the wrestlers tried to stretch Bruno Sammartino in like a sparring match, but he couldn't because Bruno was just too strong. But, yeah, Bruno became a pro wrestler, And he then wrestled for the title in 1963, and he defeated the Nature Boy Buddy Rogers in less than a minute. And this led to Bruno's first title reign, which lasted for 8 years. Like I said, that's unheard of today. Someone being champion that long. You know, a lot of people are unaware of that. So, yeah, that's pretty interesting. And, you know, Bruno's whole thing is he always wanted people to have respect for the business. You know, it's something a lot of pro wrestlers wanted, because there's a lot of bumps they take in the ring, a lot of wear and tear on their body. So they want people to, you know, respect what they do, because the public's perception of pro wrestler, and a pro wrestler did say this on a podcast, that generally speaking, the public kind of views pro wrestler as above porn star but below circus clown. So, you know, Bruno wanted to bring more respect to the business, and people would go see him. He became hugely popular. He sold out Madison Square Garden 187 times. You know, that's a lot. And he had some memorable matches with a number of famous wrestlers like George the Animal Steele, Gorilla Monsoon. He would wrestle Stan Hansen. Actually got injured in a match with Stan Hansen. Stan Hansen went to body slam him, and Bruno kind of landed the wrong way. Ended up breaking his neck. If it had been any worse, he would have been paralyzed, but he wasn't, and he managed to make a recovery. But that was later in Bruno's career when that happened. But yeah, just wrestled a lot of the pro wrestlers of the day. And now, when someone wants to be pro wrestler, a lot of times they'll have to politic for it. They'll have to politic for a title shot or a title reign. But Bruno Sammartino actually had to politic to try to lose the belt, because he had the belt for 8 years and was taking a huge toll on his body. All the bumps he was taking, he just said his body was shot. So he ended up losing the belt to Ivan Koloff in 1971. Ivan Koloff would hold the belt for a little bit, and then he would lose it to Pedro Morales. But, yeah, you know, like I said, Bruno always wanted people to have respect for the business. In 1977, around that time, when Bruno lost the belt for the last time, the business had changed a lot. Bruno lost the belt to Superstar Billy Graham, and Superstar Billy Graham, in a lot of ways, was the blueprint for the modern professional wrestler. He's really what a lot of guys have followed. You know, he really, in a lot of ways, can be considered the modern sports entertainer, because pro wrestling was moving in that direction. You know, when the current Vince McMahon Jr., as he was known at the time, when he purchased the WWF from his dad, he favored the more muscular bodybuilder type pro wrestler, and Bruno resented that. You know, Bruno was from an era where it was more about the wrestling itself and not the entertainment aspect. And he didn't like the way Vince McMahon Jr. was changing it. Because, yeah, like I said, Vince favored these big muscular bodybuilder type wrestlers. And Bruno just felt that, you know, a lot of those guys were doing too much steroids. He felt a lot of those guys didn't know how to wrestle, or they just weren't that athletic. And greatly resented what had happened to pro wrestling. You know, greatly resented the direction Vince McMahon was taking it in. And, yeah, as a result, I guess there was some bad blood between Bruno Sammartino and Vince McMahon for quite some time. Eventually, Bruno Sammartino was inducted into the Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame, but it wasn't until 2013 when he was inducted in the Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame at Madison Square Garden by Arnold Schwarzenegger. But yeah, Bruno had some memorable matches, like I'm saying. I mean, I believe he retired in the early 80s. He did have a memorable match with Larry Zbyszko. Larry Zbyszko was trained by Bruno Sammartino. And they then had like a falling out. Zbyszko had backstabbed Bruno, and they then had a match. And from what I understand, people were really mad at Zbyszko for doing this to Bruno. They were really mad at him, and Larry Zbyszko was attacked by fans. I believe he was even shot at. You know, because in those days, people really took professional wrestling seriously. I mean, if you go back and you watch some of these pro wrestling matches from the 70s and even into the 80s, you know, watch the wrestling match, but also watch the fans. Watch the fan reaction of this. I mean, the fans are just going nuts. And that's the way it was, because a lot of people believed pro wrestling was real in those days. It wasn't until 1997 when Vince McMahon, the current Vince McMahon, came out and said that pro wrestling was choreographed, that, you know, things began to change, although things were changing before then. You know, like I said, it had already been moving in more of an entertainment direction. But even more so, I think, after Vince McMahon came out and said pro wrestling was choreographed, because there was a time where if you told a pro wrestler that pro wrestling was fake, you might have to fight that wrestler shortly after saying that, because they took it very seriously, and they didn't like to hear that from people, because, you know, their body was subject to a lot of wear and tear on the road, and they took a lot of bumps in the ring and all that. So, yeah, that's the way it was in those days. There's a lot of stories where stuff like that happened. But yeah, Bruno did have some other memorable matches too. One that I should mention was he was the first person to body slam Haystacks Calhoun. Now, Haystacks Calhoun weighed over 600 pounds, and Bruno was able to body slam him, and I guess people just went nuts when he did it. He was the first person to do it. And, yeah, eventually he would go into retirement in the early 80s, but he would then come back as an announcer for a little bit. He was actually very well spoken. I should mention that. He was very well spoken all the way up until when he died. Even right before he died, and he died at the age of 82, but even right before he died, he still looked in pretty good shape. But, yeah, so he had a number of memorable matches. He actually wrestled Macho Man Randy Savage back in 87. I should mention that as well. But, yeah, just someone you don't hear of a whole lot that, you know, I think should be remembered more, because, you know, he had a lot of fans. I know Mike Tyson was a big fan of his. Bruno Mars is named Bruno because his parents were fans of Bruno Sammartino. I mean, that's why he has that name. So, but, yeah, you know, really sold out Madison Square Garden a lot. Don't even really know why he's not a household name. There is a thing on TV where, especially with pro wrestling, where if you're not on TV and you haven't been on for a while, people tend to forget who you are pretty quickly. And there is definitely some of that with pro wrestling. But yeah, the business of pro wrestling, like I said, has just changed a lot nowadays from what it was in Bruno Sammartino's era. You know, no one holds the belt for that long anymore. You know, it's always changing, and it's far more entertainment based now than it was in Bruno Sammartino's era. Nowadays, it seems like a lot of what the pro wrestlers say come from writers, and personally, I don't like that. I think the pro wrestlers should write their own material and perform their own material, because, you know, no one could write for Ric Flair except Ric Flair. No one could write those kinds of promos for him but Ric Flair himself. You know, the wrestler, the person has to do it on their own because they need that level of creative control to really get over with the fans, I feel. They really do. But, you know, today it seems there's a lot of writers, and that's really taken away a lot from the pro wrestler. You know, they should be saying their own things and writing their own material. But that's just my opinion on that. You know, business has changed quite a bit in that regard. But, yeah, should mention Bruno also had a son, David Sammartino, and I know he was in WrestleMania 1, and I don't think he was in WWE for that long. He certainly didn't have the success that his dad had, Bruno, but yeah, I do remember seeing David in a match at WrestleMania 1. But yeah, that's all I got. Just wanted to do this video talking about Bruno Sammartino. You know, he did pass away. I was sorry to hear about that. But yeah, just feel more people should, you know, be aware of him and, you know, who he was. So that's all I've got. You know, if you've watched this video, as always, I thank you for watching. Have a good night.